And now, an Arizona PBS original production.
Polarization, a Civic Crisis is presented by the ASU School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law.
And this night is turning out to be a real nail-biter.
Protesters who are out in force over the removal of a Confederate statue.
UC Berkeley taking extraordinary security measures, costing around $600,000.
Crowds gathering Chicago, New York, Philadelphia.
The academic mission of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership is to restore the nexus of liberal education and civic education in a university, and to undertake civic education with a broader community as well, so that both in the classroom and beyond, our school is making space for robust yet civil debate. And so to our distinguished speaker tonight. Jonah Goldberg is a fellow and holds the Asness Chair in Applied Liberty at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. He's concurrently a senior editor at the conservative magazine and website National Review, and is a fellow of the National Review Institute. He's a best-selling author. His most recent book, published just earlier this year, emphatically addresses the causes of America's polarization, and the title of his presentation tonight echoes the book's title, The Suicide of the West: How the Rebirth of Tribalism, Populism, Nationalism, and Identity Politics is Destroying American Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Jonah Goldberg on The Suicide of the West.
Just so you know, I flew in today, and while it's 5:13 to you guys, it's 2 hours past cocktail hour to me. I'm kind of fascinated with examples of how human nature holds constant over time. What I mean by this is, like, what are the things that if a time traveler from 1,000 or 500 years ago came to modern society and looked around would say, oh, I get it, I understand how that works. One good example is North Korea, right? We talk in the West about how North Korea is a Marxist, Stalinist regime and all of that. They've purged all of the Marxism and all of the Stalinism out of their constitution and their public rhetoric for the last 30 years. It is in no way a doctrinaire Marxist society. What it is ultimately very recognizable to anybody who read Plato's Republic, very recognizable to anybody who's looked at history of the last 5,000 years. It's a monarchy. It's not the divine right of kings, it's the divine right of Kims. But if you read the public propaganda of the regime, and when Kim Jong-il, the first one, was born, he was born on a mountain, night turned to day, rainbows appeared. I don't think there are unicorns mentioned, but you get the point, right? They have superhuman powers, they have superhuman abilities, and the point I'm trying to make is this is all perfectly natural. This is what happens when you give an individual or a regime absolute power to define the world around them for their own benefit. We revert back to things like this. So just imagine, for the sake of argument, that you're a visitor from another planet and you're tasked with the job of monitoring the progress of Homo sapiens on planet Earth. So you have to visit and you have to keep a little log about what's going on with Homo sapiens. But you can only visit once every 10,000 years. So on your first visit, what would you write in your little observational journal? You'd write something like, semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. Come back in 10,000 years. You'd write, semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. Come back in another 10,000 years. Semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food, no change. You would write this essentially, there's some change, there's some migration differences and all that kind of stuff, which would mean changes in diet. But for the most part, that's what we looked like for the first 23 visits. The 24th visit, you would see some amazing changes. The emergence of the first city-states, right, which comes with the emergence of agriculture. You'd see some fetching clay pottery. You see some metalwork and some spears and whatnot. Big deal from what you saw, the previous visit. Can't wait to get back. You come back in another 10,000 years, what do you see? Well, first of all, your spaceship would probably be picked up by NORAD. Virtually all of the progress that we consider progress of any kind has happened in the last 10,000 years. But that's really, really misleading. That's like saying the combined wealth of me and Jeff Bezos is over $70 billion. I mean, it's technically true, but the reality is that almost all of the stuff that we consider to be progress has actually happened in the last 300 years. For 250,000 years, the average human being everywhere in the world, ancient Rome, ancient China, prehistoric Africa, modern, anywhere you want to pick, until about 300 years ago, the average human being everywhere lived on no more than $3 a day. For nearly all of our existence on this planet, humanity's natural environment was grinding poverty and backbreaking labor, punctuated by an early death either from violence or some bowel-stewing disease. We live right now in the greatest moment of poverty alleviation in all of human history. In the lifetime of college students here, and the last 30 years, billions of people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. They're now talking about extreme poverty no longer being a designation in the next couple decades. And it's not because of the UN. And I don't say that the UN does some fine things, and it's helped. But the thing that did it were these ideas that started to emerge 300 years ago. That's what drives the whole world, is ideas. Another reason why I call it the miracle is because we stumbled into it by accident. Nobody intended this to happen. And what happens when you get unbelievable bounty and riches by accident that you cannot explain? You call it a miracle. It's basically the idea that our rights come from God, not from government, that we are citizens, not subjects, that the fruits of our labors belong primarily to us, that the individual is sovereign, we are captains of ourselves, and that innovation, which is the natural byproduct of owning the fruits of your labor, is a good thing. For most of Western Europe's history, innovation, this idea of coming up with a better mousetrap, was literally a sin, the sin of curitas, questioning the established order. The Chinese, Islamic civilization, they were way ahead of the West for long stretches of time. But the problem was, again and again, in society after society, innovation ended up threatening the established order, threatening the powers that be, and it was crushed. And for whatever reason, that genie gets out of the bottle 300 years ago in England, and they can't get it back in. I want to talk about the miracle in the United States. Part of my argument about why things are so bad, so nasty, and let me be the first to admit, they're nastier in Washington and they're nastier on Twitter than I think they are in real life. I think that's true. But one of the reasons why that's the case is that we are teaching people in this country to cultivate a sense of ingratitude and resentment for the society that we are born into. You see this all of the time in the sort of Howard Zinn version of American history, which is so popular out there, which basically says that we should be defined by our worst acts, by our worst chapters, right? All you need to know about America was that the Founding Fathers were racist, they had slaves, and that's it. I absolutely want to teach, I demand that we teach people the worst aspects of our past. It is crucial, because first of all, it's true. Lots of bad things were done in this country. But one of the reasons why I want to teach them, and I want them to be taught, is that you can't appreciate the good things unless you explain what the bad things were. The remarkable thing about slavery in America, or in the West, wasn't that we had it, but that we got rid of it. Lots of civilizations had slaves. There is no major civilization you can point to that doesn't have a chapter of slavery in its past, and there are lots of societies today that have slaves. But this idea that was inherent in our founding was this idea of all men and women are created equal in the eyes of God. And when we founded the country, we did not live up to that, certainly not for women, certainly not for blacks, certainly not for poor, propertyless people. But this internal logic was in there. This unfolding principle was in there. The problem that we have today, which is most evidenced by identity politics, but it goes beyond that, is this idea which is central to the sort of American creed, that you're supposed to take people as you find them. And instead, we were reverting back to a very natural tendency of turning people that look different than us, that may think different than us, into abstractions. We are demonizing them. This is what is happening. This is what has been going on in a very rarefied academic way on the left for a long time. And now, one of the things that breaks my heart more than anything else about the last few years is that conservatives, or I should say right-wingers, are embracing it too. It seems to me that perhaps the single greatest thing about the American culture, the principles that bind this country together, is that you're not supposed to judge people based upon their adherence to an abstract category. You're supposed to take them as you find them. If you walk into a room and you see someone who has a different color skin than you do, and you think that's all you need to know about them, you're bigoted. You're not allowed to call that racist if non-white people do it to white people now, but I think it's racism as I was taught it. I thought the whole point is that the thing I grew up believing was the Martin Luther King notion that you're supposed to judge people by the contents of their character, not the color of their skin. We are abandoning that. And here's the point. That's natural. You hear all of the time that people need to be taught to hate. It's just not true. There are these amazing studies that show that we have these moral taste buds of us versus them. We have the babies cry from a very early age, almost from birth, in accents. There's a French baby crying accent, there's a Russian baby, Swahili baby. We bond with the phenotype of our parents almost instantaneously, and we distrust people who don't look like our parents. Anybody who is a parent understands that babies come with a lot of preloaded software, but it needs to be updated. Hannah Arendt, one of my favorite intellectuals here, has a great line where she says, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. Right? We are not born Americans. We are not born Westerners. We are born into this tiny little civilization called the family. And the family does the heavy lifting of turning barbarians, which is our natural state, into citizens. Civilization is a verb. It is a process. It is a thing that we do. And if we don't do it well, we revert back to our human nature. Western civilization is unnatural. Democracy is unnatural. Capitalism is unnatural. Rights are unnatural. I'm not talking about natural law theory. I like all that stuff. I'm talking about it in the basic sense that up until about 5 minutes ago, the way society worked was zero sum. If you had apples, I wanted your apples, I would hit you over the head with a rock and take your apples. The glorious thing that the market does is it takes zero-sum transactions and makes them win-win. I give you money. You like money. I like apples. We both walk away happy. We teach people not to be grateful for what we have. It is a natural part of human nature to take the world you're born into for granted and think it's the way things are supposed to work. This isn't the way things are supposed to work. And if you don't teach gratitude, the opposite comes pouring in, which is a sense of entitlement and resentment. We've got this good thing going, and yet we teach ourselves, through rhetoric, through culture, through media, to celebrate this idea that it's all a bunch of crap, that it's all a ruse benefiting the 1% or the establishment or the globalists or wherever, Steve Bannon with all those layers of shirts is complaining about today. And so when I say there should be a consensus, I'll just close on this. This is the only part I've actually read from my prepared remark. On the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Calvin Coolidge gave the second best public statement on the Declaration, the first best being the Gettysburg Address. And he says, about the Declaration, there's a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we've had new thoughts and new experiences, which has given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward. Backward towards a time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. Look around. There is no better way of understanding the role of government, because it's this that was the goose that laid the golden egg, and nothing else. And so we can have all of these arguments about whether we should go left towards socialism or right towards nationalism, but when you're at the top of the mountain, it doesn't, left and right lose their meaning. Because whichever direction you go, the real direction you're going is down. Back into the muck where we all lived in little tribes or we were all ruled by aristocrats that asserted their self-interest over the common interest and over our rights and liberties. And so wherever you come on this, have a little bit of gratitude for where you are, because it could be a hell of a lot worse. Thank you all very much.
Jonah, you say we've stumbled into this miracle and we can stumble out of it.
Right.
Understanding economics, to me, is key to understanding the value of this miracle. So for someone who's dedicated most of her adult life to teaching and to economics and to teaching economics, we teach what we believe to be true. We could be wrong.
Sure.
So how do we teach what we believe to be this truth without setting ourselves up or setting our students up to fall? And how do we make ourselves worth trusting?
One of my big rules is not to talk to people, not explain things to people who know more about a subject than I do. But so much of economics these days strikes me as, to use a technical term from your field, witchcraft. It's a lot of squiggly lines and numbers and incantations. I much prefer the sort of tradition of Schumpeter, the tradition of Hayek, which had a mathematical side, but really was the deployment of the mother of all social sciences, which is history. So much of the stuff that pretends to be economics is really the imposition of political preferences, invoking the authority of economics, where it actually is pretty silent. And how you teach that to people, I am not entirely sure.
That's really nice. Thanks. Thank you.
This is a very large, ambitious book, Suicide of the West. I wanted to ask one question about civil society and culture, because you have chapters on that. You also have a very sobering chapter on the family, right? One of these mediating institutions of civil society to which you would give more authority and responsibility if we decentralize, but it's in very bad shape.
One of the huge problems we've got in our society is that our elites, the people who are doing really well in this society, top quintile, top 2 quintiles, whatever you want to call it, the bourgeois, the upper middle class, their absolute refusal to preach what they practice. Elite people practice exactly the kind of thing we should be telling everybody to do. They get the most education they can before they get married. They wait until they get married before they have kids. If you follow this success sequence, the odds of you being in poverty aren't zero, but they're shockingly close. You may not be rich, but you'll do pretty well. And if you grow up in a family with 2 parents who actually have some serious concern about your well-being, you'll probably be, your chances are going to be pretty good. There are some unbelievably impressive single moms out there But just as a matter of division of labor, it is very difficult to do all of the things that two people can do, right? If you've got a mom who's working very, very hard, it's hard for her to also go shopping and also make dinner and do all of those kinds of things. I'm not condemning her. The person I'm condemning is the dude who's out of the picture. But a little bit more of this idea that when you get married, never mind when you have a kid, you are surrendering some of your autonomy for the betterment of somebody else would be hugely beneficial, and it would redound to the betterment of all of civil society. And so one of the reasons I think why I want to push power down to the most local level possible is that it's not just family breakdown, it's almost all of these local institutions are doing a much worse job of holding society together. And we live where we actually live. We don't live on Facebook. Facebook is a frickin' envy engine, which makes us think everybody else is living much fancier, more exciting lives than we are. And it also helps, things like Facebook also help us turn our fellow citizens into abstractions that we hate. And so I want to push things down to the most local level possible, not because we'll get rid of politics, not because we'll get rid of culture wars, but we'll have accountability. You push these things down to the most local level possible, you know who the powers that be are. You know their names, right? You have democratic fights about all sorts of things, but the winners have to look the losers in the eye the next day.
You speak positively about trial and error in the course of human history. Overall, do you truly believe that United States civilization is as perfect as it will ever be? To what extent do your philosophies allow the continued process of trial and error in the process of civilization?
Sure. I think I was pretty clear about my point. I don't think America's perfect. I don't think America's ever been perfect. I think America is, it says towards a more perfect union, which basically means to the unfolding process of getting closer to an ideal. We never reach our ideals. That's why we call them ideals. What I despise about our current politics and our current culture is that because our ideals are inconvenient, we want to get rid of them and instead wallow in our instincts. What I do think is perfect in the sense that it cannot be improved upon is this idea that as a matter of law and custom, we are all equal in the eyes of government. That two people who enter a courtroom, we don't ask who their parents were. We don't care about the color of their skin or their gender to decide who should win. We base it on what the law says and on their claims and on the facts involved. If you want to come up with a really clever idea for a king or a tribunal, or maybe how we'll elect some priests who read the entrails of birds or goats and tell us how to run society, you're free to do that. But just don't tell me it's a new or modern idea. It is an ancient idea. This idea of equality before the law and human liberty and the sovereignty of the individual, that's the new and exciting idea. And all other political ideas that I have ever heard of are reactionary to one extent or another because they're trying to restore the old systems that immiserated and oppressed people for thousands of years.
It seems to me that far more important than the left-right horizontal axis is the vertical authoritarian libertarian axis. And just wanted to get your take on that as far as what we can do to maybe shrink the state or the authoritarian axis and focus a bit more on the institutions of the family, the church, the small business, as you've mentioned before. Mm-hmm.
We've bought this idea that totalitarianism is meat, right? That you can be so right-wing, you're left-wing, and all of this kind of stuff. And for years, I used to crap on that idea. That's changing, because now I still think my remnant kind of conservatism is still in the saddle, at least intellectually. But there are lots of people on the right who, Steve Bannon is a perfect example, who love statism or socialism so long as they get to call it economic nationalism and they get to make the decisions. And that idea is becoming more and more popular, in part because people have to defend what Donald Trump is doing. Donald Trump wants to pick winners and losers in the economy. And so many of my friends who denounced that when Barack Obama did it are now celebrating it because despite, Donald Trump has a mandate from the American people. He lost the popular vote, but whatever. He has a mandate from the American people to pick the winners that he likes based on a benighted understanding of economics from the, that hasn't changed since 1982. If we now have a fight between statist nationalists and statist socialists, that leaves me sitting on the sidelines with people who say, I don't want a part of either of those things. And I agree with you, the authoritarian thing is useful. I may have to call myself a classical liberal. I may have to call myself a libertarian. I might go old Whig, which I have a soft spot for. But that's the task at hand. But my position right now is, I'll be damned if they can have the party. I'll be damned if they can have the movement. And I'd rather stick it out and fight, because it's a good and glorious fight. You should be a happy warrior in this fight, because you're on the side of human liberty. You're inside the one thing in all of human history that has truly done anything to fight poverty, that has truly done anything to fight bigotry. And if I end up having to change my label to be able to explain things to people, that's a small price to pay, but I'm not there yet. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Polarization, a Civic Crisis is presented by the ASU School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law.